Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of our book reading here on Facebook. So, last time we got most of the way through Pawn of Prophecy, which is the first book of the Belgariad. We don't have very much left in this book, as you can see. We're almost done. So we'll definitely finish this one tonight, and depending on how well it's going, how well my voice is holding up, we may start in on the second one. I haven't really made up my mind yet, but I've got it here handy just in case. So I wasn't really sure whether I was going to do one of these tonight, but at the last minute I decided that I would much rather be reading a good novel than playing a video game tonight. So here we are. We're going to jump in with Chapter 17 of Pawn of Prophecy by David Eddings. Chapter 17. Barrack, Garion called through the door after he'd knocked for several minutes without any answer. Go away. Barrack's voice came thickly through the door. Barrack, it's me, Garion. I have to talk to you. There was a long silence inside the room, and finally a slow movement, then the door opened. Barrack's appearance was shocking. His tunic was rumpled and stained, his red beard was matted, the long braids he usually wore were undone, and his hair was tangled. The haunted look in his eyes, however, was the worst. The look was a mixture of horror and self-loathing, so naked that Garion was forced to avert his eyes. You saw it, didn't you, boy? Barrack demanded. You saw what happened to me out there. I didn't really see anything, Garion said carefully. I hit my head on that tree, and all I really saw were stars. You must have seen it, Barrack insisted. You must have seen my doom. Doom, Garion said. What are you talking about? You're still alive. A doom doesn't always mean death, Barrack said morosely, flinging himself into a large chair. I wish mine did. A doom is some terrible thing that's fated to happen to a man, and death's not the worst thing there is. You just let the words of that crazy old blind woman take over your imagination, Garion said. It's not only Marche, Barrack said. She's just repeating what everyone in Sherrick knows. An augurer was called in when I was born. It's a custom here. Most of the time the auguries don't show anything at all, and nothing special is going to happen during the child's life, but sometimes the future lays so heavily on one of us that almost anyone can see the doom. That's just superstition, Garion scoffed. I've never seen any fortune teller who could even tell for sure if it was going to rain tomorrow. One of them came to Faldor's farm once and told Dernick that he was going to die twice. Isn't that silly? The augurs and soothsayers of Sherrick have more skill, Barrack said, his face still sunk in misery. The doom they saw for me was always the same. I'm going to turn into a beast. I've had dozens of them tell me the same thing, and now it's happened. I've been sitting here for 2 days now, watching. The hair on my body's getting longer. My teeth are starting to get pointed. You're imagining things, Garion said. You look exactly the same to me as you always have. You're a kind boy, Garion, Barrack said. I know you're just trying to make me feel better, but I've got eyes of my own. I know that my teeth are getting pointed and my body's starting to grow fur. It won't be long until Anheg has to chain me up in his dungeon so I won't be able to hurt anyone, or I'll have to run off into the mountains and live with the trolls. Nonsense, Garion insisted. Tell me what you saw the other day, Barrack pleaded. What did I look like when I changed into a beast? All I saw were stars from banging my head on that tree, Garion said again, trying to make it sound true. I just want to know what kind of beast I'm turning into, Barrack said, his voice thick with self-pity. Am I going to be a wolf or a bear or some kind of monster no one even has a name for? Don't you remember anything at all about what happened? Garion asked carefully, trying to blot the strange double image of Barrack and the bear out of his memory. Nothing, Barrack said. I heard you shouting, and the next thing I remember was the boar lying dead at my feet and you laying under the tree with his blood all over you. I could feel the beast in me, though. I could even smell him. All you smelled was the boar, Garion said, and all that happened was you lost your head in all the excitement. Berserk, you mean? Barrack said, looking up hopefully, then shook his head. No, Garion. I've been berserk before. It doesn't feel at all the same. This was completely different. He sighed. You're not turning into a beast, Garion insisted. I know what I know, Barrack said stubbornly. And then Lady Merrill, Barrack's wife, stepped into the room through the still open door. I see that my lord is recovering his wits, she said. Leave me alone, Merrill, Barrack said. I'm not in the mood for these games of yours. Games, my lord? She said innocently. I'm simply concerned about my duties. If my lord is unwell, I'm obliged to care for him. That's a wife's right, isn't it? Quit worrying so much about rights and duties, Merrill, Barrack said. Just go away and leave me alone. My lord was quite insistent about certain rights and duties on the night of his return to Valalorn, she said. Not even the locked door of my bedchamber was enough to curb his insistence. All right, Beric said, flushing slightly. I'm sorry about that. I hope that things might have changed between us. I was wrong. I won't bother you again. Bother, my lord? She said. A duty is not a bother. A good wife is obliged to submit whenever her husband requires it of her, no matter how drunk or brutal he may be when he comes to her bed. No one will ever be able to accuse me of laxity in that regard. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Beric accused. Enjoying what, my lord? Her voice was light, but there was a cutting edge to it. What do you want, Merrill? Beric demanded bluntly. I want to serve my lord in his illness, she said. I want to care for him and watch the progress of his disease, each symptom as it appears. Do you hate me that much? Beric asked with a heavy contempt. Be careful, Merrill. I might take it into my head to insist that you stay with me. How would you like that? How would you like to be locked in this room with a raging beast? If you grow unmanageable, my lord, I can always have you chained to the wall, she suggested, meeting his enraged glare with cool unconcern. Beric, Garion said uncomfortably, I have to talk to you. Not now, Garion, Beric snapped. It's important. There's a spy in the palace. A spy? A man in a green cloak, Garion said. I've seen him several times. Many men wear green cloaks, Lady Merrill said. Stay out of this, Merrill, Beric said. He turned to Garion. What makes you think he's a spy? I saw him again this morning, Garion said, and I followed him. He was sneaking along a corridor that nobody seems to use. It passes above the hall where the kings are meeting with Mr. Wolf and Aunt Paul. He could hear every word they said. How do you know what he could hear? Oh, how do you know what he could hear? Merrill asked, her eyes narrowing. I was up there too, Garion said. I hid not far from him, and I could hear them myself, almost as if I were in the same room with them. What does he look like? Beric asked. He has sandy-colored hair, Garion said, and a beard, and as I said, he wears a green cloak. I saw him the day we went down to look at your ship. He was going into a tavern with a Murgo. There aren't any Murgos in Valalorn, Merrill said. There's one, Garion said. I've seen him before. I know who he is. He had to move around the subject carefully. The compulsion not to speak about his dark-robed enemy was as strong as always. Even the hint he had given made his tongue seem stiff and his lips numb. Who is he? Beric demanded. Garion ignored the question. And then on the day of the boar hunt I saw him in the forest. The Murgo? Beric asked. No, the man in the green cloak. He met some other men there. They talked for a while not far from where I was waiting for the boar to come. They didn't see me. There's nothing suspicious about that, Beric said. A man can meet with his friends anywhere he likes. I don't think they were friends exactly, Garion said. The one in the green cloak called one of the other men my lord, and that one was giving him orders to get close enough so he could hear what Mr. Wolf and the kings were saying. That's more serious, Beric said, seeming to forget his melancholy. Did they say anything else? The flaxen-haired man wanted to know about us, Garion said. You, me, Dernick, Silk, all of us. Flaxen-colored hair? Merrill asked quickly. The one they called my lord, Garion explained. He seemed to know about us. He even knew about me. Long, pale-colored hair? Merrill demanded. No beard, a little older than Beric? It couldn't be him, Beric said. Anneg banished him on pain of death. You're a child, Beric, she said. He'd ignore that if it suited him. I think we'd all better tell Anneg about this. Do you know him? Garion asked. Some of the things he said about Beric weren't very polite. I can imagine, Merrill said ironically. Beric was one of those who said he ought to have his head removed. Beric was already pulling on his mail shirt. Fix your hair, Merrill told him in a tone that oddly had no hint of her former rancor in it. You look like a haystack. I can't stop to fool with it now, Beric said impatiently. Come along, both of you. We'll go to Anneg at once. There was no time for any further questions, since Garion and Merrill almost had to run to keep up with Beric. They swept through the great hall, and startled warriors scrambled out of their way after one look at Beric's face. My lord Beric, one of the guards at the door of the council hall greeted the huge man. One side, Beric commanded and flung open the door with a crash. King Anneg looked up, startled at the sudden interruption. Welcome, cousin, he began. Treason, Anneg, Beric roared. The Earl of Jarvik has broken his banishment and set spies on you in your own palace. Jarvik? Anneg said. He wouldn't dare. He dared all right, Beric said. He's been seen not far from Valalorn, and some of his plotting has been overheard. Who is this Jarvik? The Riven warder asked. An earl I banished last year, Anneg said. One of his men was stopped, and we found a message on him. The message was to a Murgo in Cinderia, and it gave the details of one of our most secret councils. Jarvik tried to deny the message was his, even though it had his own seal on it, and his strong room bulged with red gold from the mines of Thalmurgos. I'd have had his head on a pole, but his wife's a kinswoman of mine, and she begged for his life. I banished him to one of his estates on the west coast instead. He looked at Beric. How did you find out about this? He asked. Last I heard, you'd locked yourself in your room and wouldn't talk to anybody. My husband's words are true, Anheg, Lady Merrill said in a voice that rang with challenge. I don't doubt him, Merrill, Anheg said, looking at her with a faintly surprised expression. I just wanted to know how he learned about Jarvik, that's all. The boy from Sendaria saw him, Merrill said, and heard him talk to a spy. I heard the boy's story myself, and I stand behind what my husband said, if anyone here dares to doubt him. Garion? Aunt Paul said, startled. May I suggest that we hear from the lad? Cohag of the Algar said quietly. A nobleman with a history of friendship for the Murgos who chooses this exact moment to break his banishment concerns us all, I think. Tell them what you told Merrill and me, Garion, Beric ordered, pushing Garion forward. Your Majesty, Garion said, bowing awkwardly, I've seen a man in a green cloak hiding here in your palace several times since we came here. He creeps along the passageways and takes a lot of trouble not to be seen. I saw him the first night we were here, and the next day I saw him going into a tavern in the city with a Murgo. Beric says there aren't any Murgos in Sherrick, but I know that the man he was with was a Murgo. How do you know? Anheg said shrewdly. Garion looked at him helplessly, unable to say Asherak's name. Well, boy? King Rodar asked. Garion struggled with the words, but nothing would come out. Maybe you know this Murgo? Silk suggested. Garion nodded, relieved that someone could help him. You wouldn't know many Murgos, Silk said, rubbing his nose with one finger. Was it the one we met in Darien, perhaps? And later in Muros, the one known as Asherak? Garion nodded again. Why didn't you tell us? Beric asked. I couldn't, Garion stammered. Couldn't? The words just wouldn't come out, Garion said. I don't know why, but I've never been able to talk about him. Then you've seen him before, Silk said. Yes, Garion said. And you've never told anybody? No. Silk glanced quickly at Aunt Paul. Is this the sort of thing you might know more about than we would, Polgara? He asked. She nodded slowly. It's possible to do it, she said. It's never been very reliable, so I don't bother with it myself. It is possible, however. Her expression grew grim. The Grolums think it's impressive, Mr. Wolf said. Grolums are easily impressed. Come with me, Garion, Aunt Paul said. Not yet, said Wolf. This is important, she said, her face hardening. You can do it later, he said. Let's hear the rest of his story first. The damage has already been done. Go ahead, Garion. What else did you see? Garion took a deep breath. All right, he said, relieved to be talking to the old man instead of the kings. I saw the man in the green cloak again the day we all went hunting. He met in the forest with a yellow-haired man who doesn't wear a beard. They talked for a while, and I could hear what they were saying. The yellow-haired man wanted to know what all of you were saying in this hall. You should have come to me immediately, King Anheg said. Anyway, Garion went on, I had that fight with a wild boar. I hit my head against a tree and I was stunned. I didn't remember what I'd seen until this morning. After King Fulrok called Durnik here, I went exploring. I was in a part of the palace where the roof is all fallen in, and I saw some footprints. I found them. I followed them, and then after a while I saw the man in the green cloak again. That was when I remembered all of it. I followed him, and he went along a corridor that passes somewhere over the top of this hall. He hid up there and listened to what you were saying. How much do you think you could hear, Garion? King Cohag asked. You were talking about somebody called the Apostate, Garion said, and you were wondering if he could use some power of some kind to awaken an enemy who's been asleep for a long time. Some of you thought you ought to warn the Arryns and the Tolnadrins, but Mr. Wolf didn't think so, and Durnik talked about how the men of the Sendaria would fight if the Angarax came. They appeared startled. I was hiding not far from the man in the green cloak, Garion said. I'm sure he could hear everything that I could. Then some soldiers came and the man ran away. That's when I decided I ought to tell Beric all about this. Up there, Silk said, standing near one of the walls and pointing at a corner of the ceiling of the hall. The mortars crumbled away. The sound of our voices carries right up through the cracks between the stones into the upper corridor. This is a very valuable boy you've brought with you, Lady Polgara, King Rodar said gravely. If he's looking for a profession, I think I could find him a place for him. Gathering information is a rewarding occupation, and he seems to have a certain natural gifts along those lines. He has some other gifts as well, Aunt Paul said. He seems to be very good at turning up in places where he's not supposed to be. Don't be too hard on the boy, Polgara, King Anheg said. He's done us a service we may never be able to repay. Garion bowed again and retreated from Aunt Paul's steady gaze. "Cousin," Anheg said to Beric, "it seems that we have an unwelcome visitor somewhere in the palace. I think I'd like to have a little talk with this lurker in the green cloak." "I'll take a few men," Beric said grimly. "We'll turn your palace upside down and shake it and see what falls out." "I'd like to have him more or less intact," Anheg cautioned. "Of course," Beric said. "Not too intact, however. As long as he's still able to talk, he'll serve our purposes." Beric grinned. "I'll make sure he's talkative when I bring him to you, cousin," he said. A bleak answering grin touched Anheg's face, and Beric started toward the door. Then Anheg turned to Beric's wife. "I'd like to thank you also, Lady Merrill," he said. "I'm sure you had a significant part in bringing this to us." "I don't need thanks, Your Majesty," she said. "It was my duty." Anheg sighed. "Must it always be duty, Merrill?" he asked sadly. "What else is there?" she said. "A very great deal, actually," the king said. "But you're going to have to find that out for yourself." "Garion," Aunt Paul said. "Come here." "Yes, ma'am." Garion said and went to her a little nervously. "Don't be silly, dear," she said. "I'm not going to hurt you." She put her fingertips lightly to his forehead. "Well?" Mr. Wolf asked. "It's there," she said. "It's very light, or I'd have noticed it before." "I'm sorry, Father." Let's see," Wolf said. He came over and also touched Garion's head with his hand. "It's not serious," he said. "It could have been," said Aunt Paul. "And it was my responsibility to see that something like this didn't happen." "Don't flog yourself about it, Paul," Wolf said. "It's very unbecoming. Just get rid of it." "What's the matter?" Garion asked, alarmed. "It's nothing to worry about, dear," Aunt Paul said. She took his right hand and touched it for a moment to the white lock at her brow. Garion felt a surge, a welter of confused impressions, and then a tingling wrench behind his ears. A sudden dizziness swept over him, and he would have fallen if Aunt Paul had not caught him. "Who's the Murgo?" she asked, looking into his eyes. "His name's Asherak," Garion said promptly. "How long have you known him?" "All my life. He used to come to Faldor's farm and watch me when I was little." "That's enough for now, Paul," Mr. Wolf said. "Let him rest a little first. I'll fix something to keep it from happening again." "Is the boy ill?" King Cohag asked. "It's not exactly an illness, Cohag," Mr. Wolf said. "It's a little hard to explain. It's cleared up now, though." Lost my spot. "I want you to go to your room, Garion," Aunt Paul said, still holding him by the shoulders. "Are you steady enough on your feet to get there by yourself?" "I'm all right," he said, still feeling a little lightheaded. "No side trips and no more exploring," she said firmly. "No, ma'am." "When you get there, lie down. I want you to think back and remember every single time you've seen this Murgo, what he did, what he said." "He never spoke to me," Garion said. "He just watched." "I'll be along in a little while," she went on, "and I want you to tell me everything you know about him. It's important, Garion, so concentrate as hard as you can." "All right, Aunt Paul," he said. Then she kissed him lightly on the forehead. "Run along now, dear," she said. Feeling strangely light-headed, Garion went to the door and out into the corridor. He passed through the great hall where Anheg's warriors were belting on swords and picking up vicious-looking battle axes in preparation for the search of the palace. Still bemused, he went through without stopping. Part of his mind seemed half asleep, but that secret inner part was wide awake. The dry voice observed that something significant had just happened. The powerful compulsion not to speak about Asherak was obviously gone. Aunt Paul had somehow pulled it out of his mind entirely. His feeling about that was oddly ambiguous. That strange relationship between himself and dark-robed silent Asherak had always been intensely private, and now it was gone. He felt vaguely empty and somehow violated. He sighed and went up the broad stairway toward his room. There were a half-dozen warriors in the hallway outside his room, probably part of Beric's search for the man in the green cloak. Garion stopped. Something was wrong, and he shook off his half-daze. This part of the palace was much too populated to make it very likely that the spy would be hiding here. His heart began racing, and step by step he began to back away toward the top of the stairs he'd just climbed. The warriors looked like any other sheriks in the palace, bearded, dressed in helmets, mail shirts, and furs, but something didn't seem exactly right. A bulky man in a dark hooded cloak stepped through the doorway of Garion's room into the corridor. It was Asherak. The Murgo was about to say something, but then his eyes fell on Garion. "Ah," he said softly. His dark eyes gleamed in his scarred face. "I've been looking for you, Garion," he said in that same soft voice. "Come here, boy." Garion felt a tentative tug at his mind that seemed to slip away as if it somehow couldn't get a sure grip. He shook his head mutely and continued to back away. "Come along now," Asherak said. "We've known each other far too long for this. Do as I say. You know that you must." The tug became a powerful grasp, which again slipped away. "Come here, Garion," Asherak commanded harshly. Garion kept backing away, step by step. "No," he said. Asherak's eyes blazed, and he drew himself up angrily. This time it was not a tug or a grasp, but a blow. Garion could feel the force of it, even as it seemed somehow to miss or to be deflected. Asherak's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. "Who did this?" he demanded. "Polgara? Belgariad? It won't do you any good, Garion. I had you once, and I can take you again any time I want to. You're not strong enough to refuse me." Garion looked at his enemy and answered out of some need for defiance. "Maybe I'm not," he said, "but I think you'll have to catch me first." Asherak looked quickly to his warriors. "That's the boy I want," he barked sharply. "Take him!" Smoothly, almost as if it were without thought, one of the warriors raised his bow and leveled an arrow directly at Garion. Asherak swung his arm quickly and knocked the bow aside just as the steel-pointed shaft was loosed. The arrow sang in the air and clattered against the stones of the wall a few feet to Garion's left. "Alive, idiot!" Asherak snarled and struck the bowman a crushing blow to the side of his head. The bowman fell twitching to the stone floor. Garion spun, dashed back to the stairs, and plunged down 3 steps at a time. He didn't bother to look back. The sound of heavy feet told him that Asherak and his men were after him. At the bottom of the stairs, he turned sharply to the left and fled down a long, dark passageway that led back into the maze of Anheg's palace. Just gonna scroll down quick and see if I've missed any comments. There's a lot of folks popped in and out tonight. Oh, thank you so much. Welcome to our stream. We'll be going for a little while anyways. I'm not sure if tonight's going to be a super long session. I'm going to have to make a choice pretty quickly. I think we're into the last chapter or two now. So we'll see about it when it comes around, but I'll have to decide whether to start the next book or not. Oh, that stuff is so good. I've got a bit of an addiction to the San Pellegrino, the really citrusy stuff. Very tasty. Can't drink too much of it, though. I think it's too acidic. All right. Chapter 18. There were warriors everywhere, and the sounds of fighting. In the first instant of his flight, Garion's plan had been simple. All he had to do was find some of Beric's warriors and he'd be safe, but there were other warriors in the palace as well. The Earl of Jarvik had led a small army into the palace by way of the ruined wings to the south, and fighting raged in the corridors. Garion quickly realized there was no way he could distinguish friend from enemy. To him, one Sherrick warrior looked the same as another. Unless he could find Beric or someone else that he recognized, he didn't dare reveal himself to any of them. The frustrating knowledge that he was running from friends as well as enemies added to his fright. It was altogether possible, even quite likely, that he would run from Beric's men directly into the arms of Jarvik's. The most logical thing to do would be to go directly back to the council hall, but in his haste to escape from Asherak, he'd run down so many dim passageways and turned so many corners that he had no idea where he was or how to get back to the familiar parts of the palace. His headlong flight was dangerous. Asherak or his men could wait around any corner to seize him, and he knew that the Murgo could quickly re-establish that strange bond between them that Aunt Paul had shattered with her touch. It was that which had to be avoided at any cost. Once Asherak had found him again, he would never let go. The only alternative to him was to find some place to hide. He dodged into another narrow passageway and stopped, panting, with his back pressed lightly against the stones of the wall. Dimly, at the far end of the hallway, he could see a narrow flight of... Dimly at the far end of this hallway, he could see a narrow flight of worn steps, twisting upward in the flickering light of a single torch. He quickly reasoned that the higher he went, the less likely he would be to encounter anyone. The fighting would most likely be concentrated on the lower floors. He took a deep breath and went swiftly to the foot of the stairs. Halfway up, he saw the flaw in his plan. There were no side passages on the stairs, no way to escape, and no place to hide. He had to get to the top quickly or chance discovery and capture, or even worse. "Boy!" A shout came from below. Garion looked quickly over his shoulder. A grim-faced sheriff in mail and helmet was coming up the stairs behind him, his sword drawn. Garion started to run, stumbling up the stairs. There was another shout from above, and Garion froze. The warrior at the top was as grim as the one below and wielded a cruel-looking axe. He was trapped between them. Garion shrank back against the stones, fumbling for his dagger, though he knew it would be of little use. Then the two warriors saw each other. With ringing shouts, they both charged. The one with the sword rushed up past Garion, while the one with the axe lunged down. The axe swung wide, missed, and clashed a shower of sparks from the stones on the wall. The sword was more true. With his hair standing on end in horror, Garion saw it slide through the downward plunging body of the axeman. The axe fell clattering down the stairs, and the axeman, still falling on top of his opponent, pulled a broad dagger from its sheath at his hip, and drove it into the chest of his enemy. The impact as the two came together tore them from their feet, and they tumbled, still grappled together down the stairs, their daggers flashing as each man struck again and again. In helpless horror, Garion watched as they rolled and crashed past him, their daggers sinking into each other with sickening sounds and blood spurting from their wounds like red fountains. Garion retched once, clenched his teeth tightly, and ran up the stairs, trying to close his ears to the awful sounds coming from below as the two dying men continued their horrid work on each other. He no longer even considered stealth, he simply ran, fleeing more from that hideous encounter on the stairs than from Asherak or the Earl of Jarvik. It just occurred to me, I think I'm saying that name, I think it's the Earl of Jarvik, because it's all kind of Norsey, all the Sherrick stuff. So I'm going to say that way from now on, the Earl of Jarvik. He no longer even considered stealth, he simply ran, fleeing more from that hideous encounter on the stairs than from Asherak or the Earl of Jarvik. At last, after how long he couldn't have said, gasping and winded, he plunged through the partially open door of a dusty, unused chamber. He pushed the door shut and stood trembling with his back against it. There was a broad, sagging bed against one wall of the room, and a small window set high in the same wall. Two broken chairs leaned wearily in the corners, and an empty chest, its lid open, in a third, and that was all. The chamber was at least a place out of the corridors where savage men were killing each other, but Garion quickly realized that the seeming safety here was an illusion. If anyone opened this door, he'd be trapped. Desperately, he began to look around the dusty room. Hanging on the bare wall across from the bed were some drapes, and thinking they might conceal some closet or adjoining chamber, Garion crossed the room and pulled them aside. There was an opening behind the drapes, though it didn't lead into another room, but instead into a dark, narrow hall. He peered into the passageway, but the darkness was so total he could only see a short distance into it. He shuddered at the thought of groping through that blackness with armed men pounding along at his heels. He glanced up at the single window and then dragged the heavy chest across the room to stand on it, so that he could see out. Perhaps he might be able to see something from the window that would give him some idea of his location. He climbed up on the chest, stood on his tiptoes, and looked out. Towers loomed here and there amid the long slate roofs of the endless galleries and halls of King Enheg's palace. It was hopeless. He saw nothing he could recognize. He turned back toward the chamber and was about to jump down from the chest when he stopped suddenly. There, clearly in the dust which lay heavily on the floor, were his footprints. He hopped quickly down and grabbed up the bolster from the long unused bed. He spread it out on the floor and dragged it around the room, erasing the footprints. He knew that he couldn't completely conceal the fact that someone had been in the room, but he could obliterate the footprints which, because of their size, would immediately make it obvious to Asherak or any of his men that whoever had been hiding here was not yet full grown. When he finished, he tossed the bolster back on the bed. The job wasn't perfect, but at least it was better than it had been. Then there was a shout in the corridor outside and the ring of steel on steel. Garion took a deep breath and plunged into the dark passageway behind the drapes. He'd gone no more than a few feet when the darkness in the passage became absolute. His skin crawled at the touch of cobwebs on his face, and the dust of years rose chokingly from the uneven floor. At first he moved quite rapidly, wanting more than anything to put as much distance between himself and the fighting in the corridor as possible. But then he stumbled, and for one heart-stopping instant it seemed he would fall. The picture of a steep stairway dropping down into the blackness flashed through his mind, and he realized that at his present pace there'd be no possible way to catch himself. He began to move more cautiously, one hand on the stones of the wall, and the other in front of his face to ward off the cobwebs, which hung thickly from the low ceiling. There was no sense of time in the dark, and it seemed to Garion he'd been groping for hours in this dark hallway that appeared to go on forever. Then, despite his care, he ran full into a rough stone wall. He felt a moment of panic. Did the passageway end here? Was it a trap? Then, flickering at one corner of his vision, he saw a dim light. The passageway didn't end, but made a rather sharp turn to the right. There seemed to be a light at the far end, and Garion gratefully followed it. As the light grew stronger, he moved more rapidly, and soon he reached the spot that was the source of the light. It was a narrow slot low on the wall. Garion knelt on the dusty stones and peered out. The hall below was enormous, and a great fire burned in a pit in the center, with the smoke rising to the openings in the vaulted roof, which lofted even above the place where Garion was. Though it looked much different from up here, he immediately recognized King Anheg's throne room. As he looked down, he saw the gross shape of King Rodar and the smaller form of Kohag, with the ever-present Hetar standing behind him. Some distance from the thrones, King Fulrock stood in conversation with Mr. Wolf, and nearby was Aunt Paul. Beric's wife was talking with Queen Eslina, and Queen Poren and Queen Salar stood not far from them. Silk paced the floor nervously, glancing now and then at the heavily guarded doors. Garion felt a surge of relief. He was safe. He was about to call down to them when the great door banged open, and King Anheg, mail-shirted and with a sword in his hand, strode into the hall, closely followed by Beric and the Riven warder, holding between them the struggling form of the flaxen-haired man Garion had seen in the forest on the day of the boar hunt. "This treason will cost you dearly, Yarvik," Anheg said grimly over his shoulder as he strode towards the throne. "Is it over, then?" Aunt Paul asked. "Soon, Polgara," Anheg said. "My men are chasing the last of Yarvik's brigands in the furthest reaches of the palace. If we hadn't been warned, it might have gone quite differently, though." Garion, his shout still hovering just behind his lips, decided at the last instant to stay silent for a few more moments. King Anheg sheathed his sword and took his place on his throne. "We'll talk for a bit, Yarvik," he said, "before what must be done is done." The flaxen-haired man gave up his hopeless struggle against Beric and the almost equally powerful Brand. "I don't have anything to say, Anheg," he said defiantly. "If the luck had gone differently, I'd be sitting on your throne right now. I took my chance, and that's the end of it." "Not quite," Anheg said. "I want the details. You might as well tell me, one way or another, you're going to talk." "Do your worst," Yarvik sneered. "I'll bite out my own tongue before I'll tell you anything." "We'll see about that," Anheg said grimly. "That won't be necessary, Anheg," Aunt Paul said, walking slowly toward the captive. "There's an easier way to persuade him." "I'm not going to say anything," Yarvik told her. "I'm a warrior, and I'm not afraid of you, witch woman." "You're a greater fool than I thought, Lord Yarvik," Mr. Wolf said. "Would you rather I did it, Paul?" "I can manage, Father," she said, not taking her eyes off Yarvik. "Carefully," the old man cautioned. "Sometimes you go to extremes. Just a touch is enough." "I know what I'm doing, old wolf," she said tartly. She stared full into the captive's eyes. Garion, still hidden, held his breath. The Earl of Yarvik began to sweat, and tried desperately to pull his eyes away from Aunt Paul's gaze, but it was hopeless. Her will commanded him, locking his eyes. He trembled, and his face grew pale. She made no move, no gesture, but merely stood before him, her eyes burning into his brain. And then, after a moment, he screamed. Then he screamed again and collapsed, his weight sagging down in the hands of the two men who held him. "Take it away," he whimpered, shuddering uncontrollably. "I'll talk, just please take it away." Silk, now lounging near Anheg's throne, looked at Hetar. "I wonder what he saw," he said. "I think it might be better not to know," Hetar replied. Queen Eslina had watched intently as if hoping to gain some hint of how the trick was done. She winced visibly when Yarvik screamed, pulling her eyes away. "All right, Yarvik," Anheg said, his tone strangely subdued. "Begin at the beginning. I want it all." "It was a little thing at first," Yarvik said in a shaking voice. "There didn't seem to be any harm in it." "There never does," Brand said. The Earl of Yarvik drew in a deep breath, glanced once at Aunt Paul and shuddered again. Then he straightened. "It started about 2 years ago," he said. "I'd sailed to Kodu in Drasnia, and I met a Nadrak merchant named Grashro there. He seemed to be a good enough fellow, and after we got to know each other, he asked me if I'd be interested in a profitable venture. I told him that I was an earl and not a common tradesman, but he persisted. He said he was nervous about the pirates who live on the islands in the Gulf of Sherrick, and an Earl's ship manned by an armed warriors was not likely to be attacked. His cargo was a single chest, not very large. I think it was some jewels he'd managed to smuggle past the customs houses in Boktor, and he wanted them delivered to Darien in Sandaria. I said I wasn't really interested, but he opened his purse and poured out gold. The gold was bright red, I remember, and I couldn't seem to take my eyes off it. I did need money, who doesn't after all, and I really couldn't see any dishonor in doing what he asked. Anyway, I carried him and his cargo to Darien and met his associate, a Murgo named Asherak. Garion started at the name, and he heard Silk's low whistle of surprise. As we'd agreed, Yarvik continued, Asherak paid me a sum equal to what Grashor had given me, and I came away from the affair with a whole pouch of gold. Asherak told me that I had done them a great favor, and if I ever needed more gold, he'd be happy to find ways for me to earn it. I now had more gold than I'd ever had at one time before, but it somehow seemed it wasn't enough. For some reason I still felt like I needed more. It's the nature of Angarat gold, Mr. Wolf said. It calls to its own. The more one has, the more it comes to possess him. That's why Murgos are so lavish with it. Asherak wasn't buying your services, Yarvik. He was buying your soul. Yarvik nodded, his face gloomy. At any rate, he continued, it wasn't long before I found an excuse to sail to Darien again. Asherak told me that since Murgos are forbidden to enter Sherrick, he developed a great curiosity about us and our kingdom. He asked me many questions, and he gave me gold for every answer. It seemed to me to be a foolish way to spend money, but I gave him the answers and took the gold. When I came back to Sherrick, I had another pouch full. I went to Yarvik's home and put the new gold with what I already had. I saw I was a rich man, and I still hadn't done anything dishonorable, but now it seemed that there wasn't enough hours in the day. I spent all my time locked in my strong room, counting my gold over and over, polishing it until it gleamed red as blood and filling my ears with the sound of its tinkling. But after a while it seemed that I didn't really have very much, and so I went back to Asherak. He said he was still curious about Sherrick, and that he'd like to know Anheg's mind. He told me he'd give me twice as much gold as I already had if I sent him word of what was said in the high councils here in the palace for a year. At first I said no, because I knew it would be dishonorable, but then he showed me the gold, and I couldn't say no anymore. From where he watched, Garion could see the expressions of those in the hall below. Their faces had a curious mingling of pity and contempt as Yarvik's story continued. It was then, Anheg, he said, that your men captured one of my messengers, and I was banished to Yarvik's home. At first I didn't mind, because I could still play with my gold, but again it wasn't long before it seemed I didn't have enough. I sent a fast ship through the Bore to Darien with a message to Asherak, begging him to find me something else to do so I could earn more gold. When the ship came back, Asherak was aboard her, and we sat down and talked about what I could do to increase my hoard. You're doubly a traitor then, Yarvik, Anheg said in a voice that was almost sad. You've betrayed me, and you've broken the oldest law in Sherrick. No Angarak has set foot on Sherrick soil since the days of Bare Shoulders himself. Yarvik shrugged. I didn't really care by then, he said. Asherak had a plan, and it seemed like a good one to me. If we could get through the city a few at a time, we could hide an army in the ruined southern wings of the palace. With surprise and a bit of luck, we could kill Anheg and the other Aloran kings, and I could take the throne of Sherrick and maybe all of Eloria as well. And what was Asherak's price? Mr. Wolf demanded, his eyes narrowing. What did he want in return for making you king? A thing so small I laughed when he told me what he wanted, Yarvik said. But he said he'd not only give me the crown, but a roomful of gold if I get it for him. What was it? Wolf repeated. He said there was a boy, about 14, in the party of King Fulrock of Sandaria. He told me that as soon as the boy was delivered to him, he'd give me more gold than I could count, and the throne of Sherrick as well. King Fulrock looked startled. The boy Garion? He asked. Why would Asherak want him? Aunt Paul's single frightened gasp carried up even to where Garion was concealed. Dernick, she said in a ringing voice, but Dernick was already on his feet and racing toward the door with Silk close behind him. Aunt Paul spun with eyes blazing, and the white lock at her brow almost incandescent in the midnight of her hair. The Earl of Yarvik flinched as her glare fell on him. If anything's happened to the boy, Yarvik, men will tremble at the memory of your fate for 1,000 years, she told him. It had gone far enough. Garion was ashamed and a little frightened by the fury of Aunt Paul's reaction. I'm all right, Aunt Paul, he called down to her through the narrow slot in the wall. I'm up here. Garion? She looked up, trying to see him. Where are you? I'm up near the ceiling, he said, behind the wall. How did you get up there? I don't know. Some men were chasing me and I ran. This is where I ended up. Come down here at once. I don't know how, Aunt Paul, he said. I ran so far and took so many turns that I don't know how to get back. I'm lost. All right, she said, regaining her composure. Stay where you are. We'll think of a way to get you down. I hope so, he said. I was thinking of that, Laska, of possibly breaking up the stream. Like if I do continue on and start reading the second book tonight, I might end the stream and start a new one just so that the recordings are separate. Or more likely, what I'll do is I'll just do two separate recordings. I might keep this stream going, but I'll end the recording and start a new one, so it breaks them up. Welcome to all of the folks who've joined us since I started the last chapter there. We're into what looks like now the last chapter of this book, so we'll figure out whether I'm going to continue tonight or not very shortly. Chapter 19. Well, it has to come out someplace, King Anheg said, squinting up toward the spot where Garion waited nervously. All he has to do is follow it. And walk directly into the arms of Asherak the Murgo? Aunt Paul asked. He's better off staying where he is. Asherak's fleeing for his life, Anheg said. He's nowhere in the palace. As I recall, he's not even supposed to be in the kingdom, she said pointedly. All right, Paul, Mr. Wolf said. He called up. Garion, which way does the passage run? It seems to go on toward the back of the hall where the thrones are, Garion answered. I can't tell for sure if it turns or not. It's pretty dark up here. We'll pass you up a couple of torches, Wolf said. Set one at the spot where you are now and then go on down the passage with the other. As long as you can see the first one, you're going in a straight line. Very clever, Silk said. I wish I were 7,000 years old so I could solve problems so easily. Wolf let that pass. I still think the safest way would be to get some ladders and break a hole in the wall, Beric said. King Anheg looked pained. Couldn't we try Belgariad's suggestion first? He asked. Beric shrugged. You're the king. Thanks, Anheg said dryly. A warrior fetched a long pole and 2 torches were passed up to Garion. If the line of the passageway holds straight, Anheg said, he should come out somewhere in the royal apartments. Interesting, King Rodar said with one raised eyebrow. It would be most enlightening to know if the passage led to the royal chambers or from them. It's entirely possible the passageway is just some long-forgotten escape route, Anheg said in an injured tone. Our history, after all, has not been all that peaceful. There's no need to suspect the worst, is there? Of course not, King Rodar said blandly. No need at all. Garion set one of the torches beside the slot in the wall and followed the dusty passageway, looking back often to be sure that the torch was still in plain sight. Eventually he came to a narrow door which opened into the back of an empty closet. The closet was attached to a splendid-looking bedchamber, and outside there was a broad, well-lighted corridor. Several warriors were coming down the corridor, and Garion recognized Torvik the huntsman among them. Here I am, he said, stepping out with a surge of relief. You've been busy, haven't you? Torvik said with a grin. Wasn't my idea, Garion said. Let's get you back to King Anheg, Torvik said. The lady, your aunt, seems concerned about you. She's angry with me, I suppose, Garion said, falling into step beside the broad-shouldered man. More than likely, Torvik said. Women are almost always angry with us for one reason or another. It's one of the things you'll have to get used to as you get older. Aunt Paul was waiting at the door to the throne room. There were no reproaches, not yet at any rate. For one brief moment she clasped him fiercely to her, and then looked at him gravely. We've been waiting for you, dear, she said almost calmly, and then led him to where the others waited. In my grandmother's quarters, she said. Anheg was saying to Torvik. What an astonishing thing. I remember her as a crotchety old lady who walked with a cane. No one is born old, Anheg, King Rodar said with a sly look. I'm sure there are many explanations, Anheg, Queen Poran said. My husband's just teasing you. One of the men looked into the passage, Your Majesty, Torvik said tactfully. The dust is very thick. It's possible it hasn't been used for centuries. What an astonishing thing, Anheg said again. The matter was then delicately allowed to drop, though King Rodar's sly expression spoke volumes. The Earl of Selene coughed politely. I think young Garion here may have a story for us, he said. I expect he has, Aunt Paul said, turning toward Garion. I seem to remember telling you to stay in your room. Asherak was in my room, Garion said, and he had warriors with him. He tried to make me come to him. When I wouldn't, he said that he had me once and could get me again. I didn't understand exactly what he meant, but I told him he'd have to catch me first. Then I ran. Brand, the Riven warder, chuckled. I don't see how you can find much fault with that, Polgara, he said. I think that if I found a Grollam priest in my room, I'd probably run away too. You're sure it was Asherak? Silk said. Garion nodded. I've known him for a long time, he said. All my life, I guess. And he knew me. He called me by name. I think I'd like to have a long talk with this Asherak, Anheg said. I want to ask him some questions about all the mischief he's been stirring up in my kingdom. I doubt you'll find him, Anheg, Mr. Wolf said. He seems to be more than just a Grollam priest. I touched his mind once in Muros. It's not an ordinary mind. I'll amuse myself with the search for him, Anheg said with a bleak expression. Not even a Grollam can walk on water, so I believe I'll just seal off all the ports in Sherrick and then put my warriors to work searching the mountains and forests for him. They get fat and troublesome in the wintertime anyway, and it'll give them something to do. Driving fat, troublesome warriors into the snow in the dead of winter isn't going to make you a popular king, Anheg, Rodar observed. Offer a reward, Silk suggested. That way you get the job done and stay popular as well. That's an idea, Anheg said. What kind of reward would you suggest, Prince Keldar? Promise to equal the weight of Asherak's head in gold, Silk said. That should lure the fattest warrior away from the dice cup and the ale keg. Anheg winced. He's a Grollam, Silk said. They probably won't find him, but they'll take the kingdom apart looking. Your gold is safe, your warriors get a bit of exercise. You get a reputation for generosity, and with every man in Sherrick looking for him with an axe, Asherak's going to be much too busy hiding to stir up any more mischief. A man whose head is more valuable to others than it is to himself has little time for foolishness. Prince Keldar, Anheg said gravely, you're a devious man. I try, King Anheg, Silk said with an ironic bow. I don't suppose you'd care to come work for me, the King of Sherrick offered. Anheg, Rodar protested. Silk sighed. Blood, King Anheg, he said. I'm committed to my uncle by our bonds of kinship. I'd be interested to hear your offer, though. It might help in future negotiations about compensation for my services. Queen Poren's laughter was like a small silver bell, and King Rodar's face became tragic. You see, he said, I'm absolutely surrounded by traitors. What's a poor fat old man to do? A grim-looking warrior entered the hall and marched up to Anheg. It's done, King, he said. Do you want to look at his head? No, Anheg said shortly. Should we put it on a pole near the harbor? The warrior asked. No, Anheg said. Yarvik was a brave man once, and my kinsman by marriage. Have him delivered to his wife for a proper burial. The warrior bowed and left the hall. The problem of the Grollam Asherak interests me, Queen Eslina said to Aunt Paul. Might we not between us, Lady Polgara, devise a way to locate him? Her expression had a certain quality of self-importance to it. Mr. Wolf spoke quickly before Aunt Paul could answer. Bravely spoken, Eslina, he said, but we couldn't allow the Queen of Sherrick to take such a risk. I'm sure your skills are formidable, but such a search opens the mind completely. If Asherak felt you looking for him, he'd retaliate instantly. Polgara wouldn't be in any danger, but I'm afraid your mind could be blown out like a candle. It would be a great shame to have the Queen of Sherrick live out the rest of her days as a raving lunatic. Eslina turned suddenly very pale, and didn't see the sly wink Mr. Wolf directed at Anheg. I couldn't permit it, Anheg said firmly. My queen is far too precious for me to allow her to take such a terrible risk. I must accede to the will of my lord, Eslina said in a relieved tone. By his command I withdraw my suggestion. The courage of my queen honors me, Anheg said with an absolutely straight face. Eslina bowed and backed away rather quickly. Aunt Paul looked at Mr. Wolf with one raised eyebrow, but let it pass. Wolf's expression became more serious as he rose from the chair in which he'd been sitting. I think the time has come to make some decisions, he said. Things are beginning to move too fast for any more delay. He looked at Anheg. Is there some place where we can speak without the risk of being overheard? There's a chamber in one of the towers, Anheg said. I thought about it before our first meeting, but... He paused and looked at Quohag. You shouldn't have let it concern you, Quohag said. I can manage stairs if I have to, and it would have been better for me to have been a little inconvenienced than to have had Yarvik spy overhear us. I'll stay with Garion, Dernick said to Aunt Paul. Aunt Paul shook her head firmly. No, she said. As long as Asherak is on the loose in Sherrick, I don't want him out of my sight. Shall we go then? Mr. Wolf said. It's getting late, and I want to leave first thing in the morning. The trail I was following is getting colder. Queen Islena, still looking shaken, stood to one side with Queen Perem and Salar, and made no effort to follow as the King Anheg Let me try that again. Queen Islena, still looking shaken, stood to one side with Poren and Salar, and made no effort to follow as King Anheg led the way from the throne room. I'll let you know what happens, King Rodar signaled to his queen. Of course, Poren gestured back. Her face was placid, but the snap of her fingers as they spoke betrayed her irritability. Calmly, child, Rodar's fingers told her. We're guests here and have to obey local customs. Whatever my lord commands, she replied with a tilt of her hands that spoke whole volumes of sarcasm. With Hedar's help, King Kohag managed the stairs, although his progress was painfully slow. I apologize for this, he puffed, stopping halfway up to catch his breath. It's as tiresome for me as it is for you. King Anheg posted guards at the foot of the stairs, then came up and closed the heavy doors behind him. Light the fire, cousin, he said to Beric. We might as well be comfortable. Beric nodded and put a torch to the wood in the fireplace. The chamber was round and not too spacious, but there was adequate room for them all, and chairs and benches to sit on. Mr. Wolf stood at one of the windows, looking down at the twinkling lights of Valalorum below. I've always been fond of towers, he said, almost to himself. My master lived in one like this, and I enjoyed the time I spent there. I'd give my life to have known Aldur, Kohag said softly. Was he really surrounded by light, as some say? He seemed quite ordinary to me, Mr. Wolf said. I lived with him for 5 years before I even knew who he was. Was he really as wise as we're told? Anheg asked. Probably wiser, Wolf said. I was a wild and errant boy when he found me dying in a snowstorm outside his tower. He managed to tame me, though it took him several hundred years to do it. He turned from the window with a deep sigh. To work, then, he said. Where will you go to take up the search? King Fulrak asked. Kamar, Wolf said. I found the trail there. I think it led down into Erendia. We'll send warriors with you, Anheg said. After what's happened here, it looks like Grolums may try to stop you. No, Wolf said firmly. Warriors are useless in dealing with the Grolums. I can't move with an army underfoot, and I won't have time to explain to the King of Erendia why I am invading his kingdom with a horde of troops at my back. It takes even longer to explain things to Arryns than it does to Alorns, impossible as that sounds. Don't be uncivil, Father, Aunt Paul said. It's their world too, and they're concerned. You wouldn't really necessarily need an army, Belgarath, King Rodar said, but wouldn't it be prudent to take along a few good men? There's very little that Polgara and I can't deal with by ourselves, Wolf said, and Silk, Beric, and Dernick are along to deal with the more mundane problems. The smaller our group, the less attention we'll attract. He turned to Kohag. As long as we're on the subject, though, I'd like to have your son Hedar with us. We're likely to need his rather specialized talents. Impossible, Hedar said flatly. I have to remain with my father. No, Hedar, Kohag said. I don't intend for you to live out your life as a cripple's legs. I've never felt any restriction in serving you, Father, Hedar said. There are plenty of others with the same talents I have. Let the Ancient One choose another. How many Shadarim are there among the Algars? Mr. Wolf asked gravely. Hedar looked at him sharply as if trying to tell him something with his eyes. King Kohag drew in his breath sharply. Hedar, he asked, is this true? Hedar shrugged. It may be, Father, he said. I didn't think it was important. Kohag looked at Mr. Wolf. Wolf nodded. It's true, he said. I knew it the first time I saw him. He's a Shadar. He had to find out for himself, though. Kohag's eyes suddenly brimmed with tears. My son, he said proudly, pulling Hedar into a rough embrace. It's no great thing, Father, Hedar said quietly, as if suddenly embarrassed. What are they talking about? Garion whispered to Silk. It's something the Algars take very seriously, Silk said softly. They think there are some people who can talk to horses with their thoughts alone. They call these people Shadarim, clan chiefs of the horses. It's very rare, maybe only 2 or 3 in a whole generation. It's instant nobility for any Algar who has it. Kohag's going to explode with pride when he gets back to Algaria. Is it that important? Garion asked. Silt shrugged. The Algar seem to think so, he said. All the clans gather around the stronghold when they find a new Shadar. The whole nation celebrates for 6 weeks. There are all kinds of gifts. Hadar will be a rich man if he chooses to accept them. He may not. He's a strange fellow. You must go, Kohag said to Hadar. The pride of Belgariad goes with you. Your duty is clear. As my father decides, Hadar said reluctantly. Good, Mr. Wolf said. How long will it take you to go to Belgariad, pick up a dozen or so of your best horses, and take them to Kamar? Hadar thought for a moment. 2 weeks, he said, if there aren't any blizzards in the mountains of Sindaria. We'll all leave here in the morning then, Wolf said. Anheg can give you a ship. Take the horses along the Great North Road to the place a few leagues east of Kamar where another road strikes off to the south. It fords the Greater Kamar River and runs down to join the Great West Road at the ruins of Volwasun in northern Erendia. We'll meet you there in 2 weeks. Hadar nodded. We'll also be joined to Volwasun by an Asturian errand, Wolf went on, and somewhat later by a Mimbrate. They might be useful to us in the south. And we'll also fulfill the prophecies, Anheg said cryptically. Wolf shrugged, his bright blue eyes twinkling suddenly. I don't object to fulfilling prophecies, he said, as long as it doesn't inconvenience me too much. Is there anything we can do to help in the search? Brand asked. You'll have enough to do, Wolf said. No matter how our search turns out, it's obvious that the Angarax are getting ready for some kind of major action. If we're successful, they might hesitate, but Angarax don't think the way we do. Even after what happened at Vomimber, they might decide to risk an all-out attack on the west. It could be that they're responding to prophecies of their own that we don't know anything about. In any event, I think you should be ready for something fairly major from them. You'll need to make preparations. Anheg grinned wolfishly. We've been preparing for them for 5,000 years, he said. This time we'll purge the whole world of the Angarak infection. When Torak One-Eye awakens, he'll find himself as alone as Mara and just as powerless. Maybe, Mr. Wolf said, but don't plan the victory celebration until the war's over. Make your preparations quietly, and don't stir up the people in your kingdoms any more than you have to. The West is crawling with Grollems, and they're watching everything we do. The trail I'll be following could lead me into Thalmurgos, and I'd rather not have to deal with an army of Murgos massed on the border. I can play the watching game too, King Rodar said with a grim look on his plump face. Probably even better than the Grollems. It's time to send a few more caravans to the east. The Angarax won't move without help from the east, and the Malorians will have to cross over into Garog Nidrak before they deploy south. A bribe or two here or there, a few barrels of strong ale in the right mining camps. Who knows what a bit of diligent corruption might turn up. A chance word or two could give us several months' warning. If they're planning anything major, the Thulls will be building supply dumps along the eastern escarpment, Kohag said. Thulls aren't bright, and it's easy to observe them without being seen. I'll increase my patrols along those mountains. With a little luck, we might be able to anticipate their invasion route. Is there anything else we can help you with, Belgarath? Mr. Wolf thought for a moment. Suddenly he grinned. I'm certain that our thief is listening very hard, waiting for one of us to speak his name or the name of the thing he stole. Sooner or later, someone's bound to make a slip, and once he locates us, he'll be able to hear every word we say. Instead of trying to gag ourselves, I think it might be better if we give him something else to listen to. If you can arrange it, I'd like to have every minstrel and storyteller in the north start retelling certain old stories. You know the ones. When those names start sounding in every village marketplace north of the Kamar River, it'll set up a roaring in his ears like a thunderstorm. If nothing else, it'll give us freedom to speak. In time, he'll get tired of it and will stop listening. It's getting late, Father, Anpal reminded him. Wolf nodded. We're playing a deadly game, he told them all. But our enemies are playing one just as deadly. Their danger's as great as ours, and right now no one can predict what will finally happen. Make your preparations and send out men you can trust to keep watch. Be patient and don't do anything rash. That could be more dangerous than anything else right now. At the moment, Polgara and I are the only ones who can act. You're going to have to trust us. I know that sometimes some of the things we've done can seem a bit strange, but there are reasons for what we do. Please, don't interfere again. I'll get word to you now and then about our progress. If I need you to do anything else, I'll let you know, all right? The kings nodded gravely, and everyone rose to their feet. Anheg stepped over to Mr. Wolf. Could you come to my study in an hour or so, Belgarath? He said quietly. I'd like to have a few words with you and Polgara before your departure. If you wish, Anheg, Mr. Wolf said. Come along, Garion, Anpal said. We have packing to take care of. Garion, a little awed by the solemnity of the discussions, rose quietly and followed her to the door. Yes, I've got a fairly easy way, I think, of separating the two things for folks on YouTube. So if I continue on, which I think I'm very likely to do, actually, I'm only about a third of the way through my beer right now, and we're only about an hour in. When I finish this last chapter, probably we'll take like a 5-minute intermission. I might chat with you guys for a little bit, but I'll stop the recording. I'll leave the stream going, so you won't have to find a different post. We'll just, we'll keep on as we are right here, and then for folks on YouTube, the second half of it will just be a separate video file that I'll upload. Chapter 20. King Anheg's study was a large, cluttered room high in a square tower. Books bound in heavy leather lay everywhere, and strange devices with gears and pulleys and tiny brass chains sat on the tables and stands. Intricately drawn maps, with beautiful illuminations, were pinned up on the walls, and the floor was littered with scraps of parchment and covered with tiny writing. King Anheg, his coarse black hair hanging in his eyes, sat at a slanted table in the soft glow of a pair of candles, studying a large book written on thin sheets of crackling parchment. The guard at the door let them in without another word, and Mr. Wolf stepped briskly into the center of the room. "You wanted to see us, Anheg?" The King of Sherrick straightened from his book and laid it aside. "Belgarath," he said with a short nod of greeting. "Polgara." He glanced at Garion, who stood uncertainly near the door. "I meant what I said earlier," and Paul said. "I'm not going to let him out of my sight until I know for certain that he's out of reach of the Grollam Asherak." "Anything you say, Polgara," Anheg said. "Come in, Garion." "I see you're continuing your studies," Mr. Wolf said approvingly, glancing at the littered room. "There's so much to learn," Anheg said with a helpless gesture that included all the welter of books and papers and strange machines. "I have a feeling I might have been happier if you'd never introduced me to this impossible task." "You asked me," Wolf said simply. "You could have said no," Anheg laughed. Then his brutish face turned serious. He glanced once at Garion and began to speak in an obviously oblique manner. "I don't want to interfere," he said, "but the behavior of this Asherak concerns me." Garion moved away from Aunt Paul and began to study one of the strange little machines sitting on a nearby table, being careful not to touch it. "We'll take care of Asherak," Aunt Paul said. But Anheg persisted. "There have been rumors for centuries that you and your father have been protecting—" He hesitated, glancing at Garion, then continued smoothly. "A certain thing that must be protected at all cost. Several of my books speak of it." "You read too much, Anheg," Aunt Paul said. Anheg laughed again. "It passes the time, Polgara," he said. "The alternative is drinking with my earls, and my stomach's getting a little delicate for that, and my ears as well. Have you any idea how much noise a full hall of drunk sherricks can make? My books don't shout or boast, and they don't fall down or slide under the tables and snore. They're much better company, really." "Foolishness," Aunt Paul said. "We're all foolish at one time or another," Anheg said philosophically. "But let's get back to this other matter. If the rumors I mentioned are true, aren't you taking some serious risks? Your search is likely to be very dangerous." "No place is really safe," Mr. Wolf said. "Why take chances you don't have to?" Anheg asked. "Asherak isn't the only Grollam in the world, you know." "I can see why they call you Anheg the Sly," Wolf said with a smile. Wouldn't it be safer to leave this certain thing in my care until you return?" Anheg suggested. "We've already found that not even Val Lorn is safe from the Grollams, Anheg," Aunt Paul said firmly. "The mines of Thalmurgos and Garog Nadrak are endless, and the Grollams have more gold at their disposal than you could even imagine. How many others like Yarvik have they bought? The old wolf and I are very experienced at protecting this certain thing you mentioned. It'll be safe with us." "Thank you for your concern, however," Mr. Wolf said. "The matter concerns us all," Anheg replied. Garion, despite his youth and occasional recklessness, was not stupid. It was obvious that what they were talking about involved him in some way, and quite possibly had to do with the mystery of his parentage as well. To conceal the fact that he was listening as hard as he could, he picked up a small book bound in a strangely textured black leather. He opened it, but there were neither pictures nor illuminations, merely a spidery-looking script that seemed strangely repulsive. Aunt Paul, who always seemed to know what he was doing, looked over at him. What are you doing with that? She asked sharply. Just looking, he said. I can't read. Put it down immediately, she told him. King Anheg smiled. You wouldn't be able to read it anyway, Garion, he said. It's written in Old Angarak. What are you doing with that filthy thing anyway? Aunt Paul asked Anheg. You of all people know that it's forbidden. It's only a book, Paul, Mr. Wolf said. It doesn't have any power unless it's permitted to. Besides, Anheg said, rubbing thoughtfully at the side of his face, the book gives us some clues into the mind of our enemy. It's always a good thing to know. You can't know Torak's mind, Aunt Paul said, and it's dangerous to open yourself to him. He can poison you without your ever knowing it's happening. I don't think there's any danger of that, Paul, Wolf said. Anheg's mind is well trained enough to avoid the traps in Torak's book. They're pretty obvious, after all. Anheg looked across the room at Garion and beckoned to him. Garion crossed and stood in front of the King of Sherrick. You're an observant young man, Garion, Anheg said gravely. You've done me a service today, and you can call on me at any time for service in return. Know that Anheg of Sherrick is your friend. He extended his right hand, and Garion took it in his own without thinking. King Anheg's eyes grew suddenly wide, and his face paled slightly. He turned Garion's hand over and looked down at the silvery mark on the boy's palm. Then Aunt Paul's hands were also there, firmly closing Garion's fingers and removing them from Anheg's grip. It's true, then, Anheg said softly. Enough, Aunt Paul said. Don't confuse the boy. Her hands were still firmly holding Garion's. Come along, dear, she said. It's time to finish packing. And she turned and led him from the room. Garion's mind was racing. What was there about the mark on his palm that had so startled Anheg? The birthmark he knew was hereditary. Aunt Paul had once told him that his father's hand had the same mark, but why would that be of interest to Anheg? It had gone too far. His need to know became almost unbearable. He had to know about his parents, about Aunt Paul, about all of it. If the answers hurt, then they just have to hurt. At least he would know. The next morning was clear, and they left the palace for the harbour quite early. They all gathered in the courtyard where the sleighs awaited. There was no need for you to come out in the cold like this, Merrill, Beric told his fur-robed wife as she mounted the sleigh beside him. I have a duty to see my lord safely to his ship, she replied with an arrogant lift of her chin. Beric sighed. Whatever you wish, he said. With King Anheg and Queen Islena in the lead, the sleighs whirled out from the courtyard and into the snowy streets. The sun was very bright and the air was crisp. Garion rode silently with Silk and Hedar. Why so quiet, Garion? Silk asked. A lot of things have happened here that I don't understand, Garion said. No one can understand everything, Hedar said rather sententiously. I think is the word, sententiously. Sherricks are a violent and moody people, Silk said. They don't even understand themselves. It's not just the Sherricks, Garion said, struggling with the words. It's Aunt Paul and Mr. Wolf and Asherak, all of it. Things are happening so fast. I can't get it all sorted out. Events are like horses, Hedar told him. Sometimes they run away. After they've run for a while, though, they'll start to walk again. Then there will be time to put everything together. I hope so, Garion said dubiously and fell silent again. The sleighs came around a corner into the broad square before the temple of Belar. The blind woman was there again, and Garion realized that he'd been half expecting her. She stood on the steps of the temple and raised her staff. Unaccountably, the horses which pulled the sleighs stopped, trembling, despite the urgings of their drivers. Hail, great one, the blind woman said. I wish thee well on thy journey. The sleigh in which Garion was riding had stopped closest to the temple steps, and it seemed the old woman was speaking to him. Almost without thinking, he answered, Thank you, but why do you call me that? She ignored the question. Remember me, she commanded, bowing deeply. Remember Marchi when thou comest into thine inheritance. It was the second time she said that, and Garion felt a sharp pang of curiosity. What inheritance? He demanded. But Beric was roaring with fury and struggling to throw off the fur robe and draw his sword at the same time. King Anheg was also climbing down from the sleigh, his coarse face livid with rage. No, Aunt Paul said sharply from nearby. I'll tend to this. She stood up. Hear me, witch woman, she said in a clear voice, casting back the hood of her cloak. I think you see too much with those blind eyes of yours. I'm going to do you a favor so that you'll no longer be troubled by the darkness and these disturbing visions which grow out of it. Strike me down if it pleases thee, Polgara, the old woman said. I see what I see. I won't strike you, Marchie, Aunt Paul said. I'm going to give you a gift instead. She raised her hand in a brief and curious gesture. Garion saw it happen quite plainly, so there was no way that he could later persuade himself that it had all been some trick of the eye. He was looking directly at Marchie's face, and saw the white film drain down off her eyes like milk draining down the inside of a glass. The old woman stood frozen on the spot as the bright blue of her eyes emerged from the film which had covered them. And then she screamed. She held up her hands, looked at them, and screamed again. There was in her scream a wrenching note of indescribable loss. "What did you do?" Queen Islena demanded. "I gave her back her eyes," Aunt Paul said, sitting down again and rearranging the fur robe about her. "You can do that?" Islena asked, her face blanching and her voice weak. "Can't you? It's a simple thing, really." "But," Queen Perrin objected, "with her eyes restored, she'll lose that other vision, won't she?" "I imagine so," Aunt Paul said, "but that's a small price to pay, isn't it?" "She'll no longer be a witch, then?" Perrin pressed. "She wasn't really a very good witch anyway," Aunt Paul said. "Her vision was clouded and uncertain. It's better this way. She won't be disturbing herself and others with shadows anymore." She looked at King Anheg, who sat frozen with awe behind his half-fainting queen. "Shall we continue?" she asked calmly. "Our ship is waiting." The horses, as if released by her words, leapt forward, and the sleigh sped away from the temple, spreading snow from their runners. Garion glanced back once more. Old Marchie stood on the steps of the temple, looking at her two outstretched hands and sobbing uncontrollably. "We've been privileged to witness a miracle, my friends," Hedar said. "I gather, however, that the beneficiary was not very pleased with it," Silk said dryly. "Remind me not to offend Polgara. Her miracles seem to have two edges to them." So, I was wrong. There's one more chapter, but it's super short. The chapters in this series of books are not a standard length, so some of them are... There was an earlier one that I read last session that was super long. It took like 40 minutes to get through the one chapter, and these ones were turning out in like 10 minutes. Chapter 21. The low slanting rays of the morning sun glittered on the icy waters of the harbour as their sleighs halted near the stone quays. Greldick's ship rocked and strained in her hawsers, and a smaller ship nearby also waited with seeming impatience. Hedar stepped down and went over to speak with Kohag and Queen Salar. The three of them talked together quietly and seriously, drawing a kind of a shell of privacy about them. Queen Islena had partially regained her composure, and sat in her sleigh straight-backed, and with a fixed smile on her face. After Anheg had gone to speak with Mr. Wolf, Aunt Paul crossed the icy wharf and stopped near the sleigh of the Queen of Sherrick. "If I were you, Islena," she said firmly, "I'd find another hobby. Your gifts in the art of sorcery are limited, and it's a dangerous area for dabbling. Too many things can go wrong if you don't know what you're doing." The Queen stared at her mutely. "Oh," Aunt Paul said, "one other thing. It would be best, I think, if you broke off your connections with the bear cult. It's hardly proper for a queen to have dealings with her husband's political enemies." Islena's eyes widened. "Does Anheg know?" she asked in a stricken voice. "I wouldn't be surprised," Aunt Paul said. "He's much more clever than he looks, you know. You're walking very close to the edge of treason. You ought to have a few babies. They give you something useful to do with your time and keep you out of trouble. It's only a suggestion, of course, but you might think it over." "I've enjoyed our visit, dear. Thank you for your hospitality." And with that, she turned and walked away. Silk whistled softly. "That explains a few things," he said. "Explains what?" Garion asked. "The High Priest of Belar's been dabbling in Sherrick politics lately. He's obviously gone a bit further than I thought in penetrating the palace." "The Queen?" Garion asked, startled. "Islena's obsessed with the idea of magic," Silk said. "The bear cultists dabble in certain kinds of rituals that might look sort of mystical to someone as gullible as she is." He looked quickly toward where King Rodar was speaking with the other kings and Mr. Wolf. Then he drew in a deep breath. "Let's go talk to Perrin," he said, and led the way across the wharf to where the tiny blonde Queen of Drasnia stood looking out at the icy sea. "Highness," Silk said deferentially. "Dear Keldar," she said, smiling at him. "Could you give some information to my uncle for me?" he asked. "Of course." "It seems that Queen Islena been a bit indiscreet," Silk said. "She's been involved with the bear cult here in Sherrick." "Oh dear," Perrin said. "Does Anheg know?" "It's hard to say," Silk told her. "I doubt if he'd admit it if he did. Garion and I happened to hear Polgara tell her to stop it. I hope that puts an end to it, Perrin said. If it went too far, Anheg would have to take steps. That could be tragic. Polgara was quite firm, Silk said. I think Islena will do as she's told, but advise my uncle. He likes to be kept aware of this kind of thing. I'll tell him about it, she said. You might also suggest he keep his eyes on the local chapters of the cult in Boktor and Kotu, Silk suggested. This kind of thing isn't usually isolated. It's been about 50 years since the last time the cult had to be suppressed. Queen Perrin nodded gravely. I'll see to it that he knows, she said. I've got some of my own people planted in the bear cult. As soon as we get back to Boktor, I'll talk with them and see what's afoot. Your people? Have you gone that far already? Silk said in a bantering tone. You're maturing rapidly, my queen. It won't be long until you're as corrupt as the rest of us. Boktor is full of intrigue, Keldar, the queen said primly. It isn't just the bear cult, you know. Merchants from all over the world gather in our city, and at least half of them are spies. I have to protect myself, and my husband. Does Rodar know what you're up to? Silk asked slyly. Of course he does, she said. He gave me my first dozen spies himself as a wedding present. How typically Drasnian, Silk said. It's only practical, after all, she said. My husband's concerned with matters involving other kingdoms. I try to keep an eye on things at home, and leave his mind free for that kind of thing. My operations are a bit more modest than his, but I manage to stay aware of things. She looked at him slyly from beneath her eyelashes. If you ever decide to come home to Boktor and settle down, I might just be able to find work for you. Silk laughed. The world seems to be full of opportunities lately, he said. The queen looked at him seriously. When are you coming home, Keldar? She asked. When will you stop being this vagabond, Silk, and come back to where you belong? My husband misses you very much, and you could serve Drasnia more by becoming his chief advisor than by all this flitting about the world. Silk looked away, squinting into the bright wintry sun. Not just yet, Your Highness, he said. Belgariad needs me too, and this is a very important thing we're doing just now. Besides, I'm not ready to settle down yet. This game is still entertaining. Perhaps someday when we're all much older it won't be anymore. Who knows? She sighed. I miss you too, Keldar, she said gently. Poor, lonely little queen, Silk said, half-mockingly. You're impossible, she said, stamping her tiny foot. One does one's best, he grinned. Hedar had embraced his father and mother and leaped across the deck of the small ship King Anheg had provided them. Belgariad, he called as the sailors slipped the stout ropes that bound the ship to the quay. I'll meet you in 2 weeks in the ruins of Voa soon. We'll be there, Mr. Wolf replied. The sailors pushed the ship away from the quay and began to row out into the bay. Hedar stood on the deck, his long scalp lock flowing in the wind. He waved once, then turned to face the sea. A long plank was run down over the side of Captain Greldick's ship to the snow-covered stones. Shall we go on board, Garion? Silk said. They climbed the precarious plank and stepped out onto the deck. Give our daughters my love, Beric said to his wife. I will, my lord, Merrill said in that same stiffly formal tone she always used with him. Have you any other instructions? I won't be back for quite some time, Beric said. Plant the south fields to oats this year, and let the west fields lie fallow. Do whatever you think is best with the north fields, and don't move the cattle up to the high pastures until all the frost is out of the ground. I'll be most careful of my husband's lands and herds, she said. They're yours, too, Beric said. As my husband wishes. Beric sighed. You never let it rest, do you, Merrill? He said sadly. My lord? Forget it. Will my lord embrace me before he leaves? She asked. What's the point? Beric said. He jumped across to the ship and immediately went below. Aunt Paul stopped on her way to the ship and looked gravely at Beric's wife, then looked as if she were about to say something. Then, without warning, she suddenly laughed. Something amusing, Lady Polgara? Merrill asked. Very amusing, Merrill, Aunt Paul said with a mysterious smile. Might I be permitted to share it? Oh, you'll share it, Merrill, Aunt Paul promised, but I wouldn't want to spoil it for you by telling you too soon. She laughed again and stepped out onto the plank that led to the ship. Dernick offered his hand to steady her, and the two of them crossed to the deck. Mr. Wolf clasped hands with each of the kings in turn, and then nimbly crossed to the ship. He stood for a moment on the deck looking at the ancient snow-shrouded city of Valalorum, and the towering mountains of Sherrick rising behind. Farewell, Belgariad, King Anheg called. Mr. Wolf nodded. Don't forget about the minstrels, he said. We won't, Anheg promised. Good luck. Mr. Wolf grinned, and then walked forward toward the prow of Greldick's ship. Garion, on an impulse, followed him. There were questions which needed answers, and the old man would know if anyone would. "Mr. Wolf," he said when they both reached the high prow. "Yes, Garion?" He wasn't sure where to start, so Garion approached the problem obliquely. "How did Aunt Paul do that to old Marchie's eyes?" "The will and the word," Wolf said, his long cloak whipping about him in the stiff breeze. "It isn't difficult." "I don't understand," Garion said. "You simply will something to happen," the old man said, "and then speak the word. If your will's strong enough, it happens." "So that's all there is to it?" Garion asked, a little disappointed. "That's all," Wolf said. "Is the word a magic word?" Wolf laughed, looking out at the sun glittering sharply on the winter sea. "No," he said, "there aren't any magic words. Some people think so, but they're wrong. Grollems use strange words, but it's not really necessary. Any word will do the job. It's the will that's important, not the word. The word's just a channel for the will." "Could I do it?" Garion asked hopefully. Wolf looked at him. "I don't know, Garion," he said. "I wasn't much older than you the first time I did it, but I'd been living with Aldur for several years. That makes a difference, I suppose." "What happened?" "My master wanted me to move a rock," Wolf said. "He seemed to think it was in his way. I tried to move it, but it was too heavy. After a while I got angry and I told it to move. It did. I was a little surprised, but my master didn't seem to think it was so unusual." "You just said move, that's all?" Garion was incredulous. "That's all," Wolf shrugged. "It seemed so simple I was surprised I hadn't thought of it before. At the time I imagined that anybody could do it, but men have changed quite a bit since then. Maybe it isn't possible anymore. It's hard to say, really. I always thought that sorcery had to be done with long spells and strange signs and things like that," Garion said. "Those are just the devices of tricksters and charlatans," Wolf said. "They make a fine show and impress and frighten simple people, but spells and incantations have nothing to do with the real thing. It's all in the will. Focus the will and speak the word and it happens. Sometimes a gesture of some sort helps, but it isn't really necessary. Your aunt always seems to want to gesture when she makes something happen. I've been trying to break her of that habit for hundreds of years now." Garion blinked. "Hundreds of years?" he gasped. "How old is she?" "Older than she looks," Wolf said. "It isn't polite to ask questions about a lady's age, however." Garion felt a sudden, shocking emptiness. The worst of his fears had just been confirmed. "Then she isn't really my aunt, is she?" he asked sickly. "What makes you say that?" Wolf asked. "She couldn't be, could she? I always thought that she was my father's sister, but if she's hundreds and thousands of years old, it would be impossible." "You're much too fond of that word, Garion," Wolf said. "When you get right down to it, nothing, or at least very little, is actually impossible." "But how could she be? My aunt, I mean." "All right," Wolf said. "Polgara was not, strictly speaking, your father's sister. Her relationship to him was quite a bit more complex. She was the sister of his grandmother, his ultimate grandmother, if there is such a term, and of yours as well, of course." "Then she'd be my great-aunt," Garion said with a faint spark of hope. It was something, at least. "I don't know that I'd use that precise term around her," Wolf grinned. "She might take offense. Why are you so concerned about all this?" I was afraid that maybe she just said that she was my aunt, and that there wasn't really any connection between us at all," Garion said. "I've been afraid of that for quite a while now." "Why were you afraid?" "It's kind of hard to explain," Garion said. "You see, I don't really know who I am or what I am. Silk says I'm not a Cendar, and Beric says I look kind of like a Riven, but not exactly. I always thought I was a Cendar, like Dernick, but I guess I'm not. I don't know anything about my parents, or where they came from, or anything like that. If Aunt Paul isn't related to me, then I don't have anybody in the world at all. I'm all alone, and it's a very bad thing." "But now it's all right, isn't it?" Wolf said. "Your aunt is really your aunt. At least your blood and hers are the same." "I'm glad you told me," Garion said. "I've been worried about it." Greldick's sailors untied the hawsers and began to push the ship away from the quay. "Mr. Wolf," Garion said as a strange thought occurred to him. "Yes, Garion?" "Aunt Paul really is my aunt, or my great-aunt?" "Yes." "And she's your daughter?" "I have to admit that she is," Wolf said wryly. "I try to forget that sometimes, but I can't really deny it." Garion took a deep breath and plunged directly into it. "If she's my aunt and you're her father," he said, "wouldn't that sort of make you my grandfather?" Wolf looked at him with a startled expression. "Why, yes," he said, laughing suddenly. "I suppose that in a way it does. I've never really thought of it exactly like that before." Garion's eyes filled suddenly with tears, and he impulsively embraced the old man. "Grandfather," he said, trying the word out. "Well, well," Wolf said, his own voice strangely thick. "What a remarkable discovery." Awkwardly, he patted Garion's shoulder. They were both a little embarrassed by Garion's sudden display of affection, and they stood up silently, watching as Greldic sailors rowed the ship out into the harbor. "Grandfather," Garion said after a while. "Yes?" "What really happened to my mother and father? I mean, how did they die?" Wolf's face became very bleak. "There was a fire," he said shortly. "A fire?" Garion said weakly, his imagination lurching back from that awful thought of the unspeakable pain. "How did it happen?" "It's not very pleasant," Wolf said grimly. "Are you really sure you want to know?" "I have to, Grandfather," Garion said quietly. "I have to know everything I can about them. I don't know why, but it's very important." Mr. Wolf sighed. "Yes, Garion," he said. "I guess it would be at that." "All right, then. If you're old enough to ask the questions, you're old enough to hear the answers." He sat down on his sheltered bench out of the chilly wind. "Come over here and sit down," he patted the bench beside him. Garion sat down and pulled the cloak around him. "Let's see," Wolf said, scratching thoughtfully at his beard. "Where to start?" He pondered for a moment. "Your family's very old, Garion," he said finally. "And like many old families, it has a certain number of enemies." "Enemies?" Garion was startled. That particular idea had never occurred to him before. "It's not uncommon," Wolf said. "When we do something someone else doesn't like, they tend to hate us. The hatred builds up over the years, and it turns into something almost like a religion. They hate not only us, but everything connected with us. Anyway, a long time ago, your family's enemies became so dangerous that your aunt and I decided the only way we could protect the family was to hide it." "You aren't telling me everything," Garion said. "No," Wolf said blandly. "I'm not. I'm telling you as much as is safe for you to know right now. If you knew certain things, you'd act differently, and people would notice that. It's safer if you stay ordinary for a while longer." "You mean ignorant," Garion accused. "All right, ignorant then. Do you want to hear the story, or do you want to argue?" "I'm sorry," Garion said. "It's all right," Wolf said, patting Garion's shoulder. "Since your aunt and I are related to your family in a rather special way, we're naturally interested in your safety. That's why we hid your people." "Can you actually hide a whole family?" Garion asked. "It's never been that big a family," Wolf said. "It seems, for one reason or another, to be a single unbroken line. No cousins or uncles or that kind of thing. It's not all that hard to hide a man and his wife and a single child. We've been doing it for hundreds of years now. We've hidden them in Tolnerdra, Riva, Sherik, Drasnia, all kinds of places. They've lived simple lives, artisans mostly, sometimes ordinary peasants, the kind of people nobody would ever look at twice. Anyway, everything had gone well until about 20 years ago. We moved your father, Garan, from a place in Erendia to a little village in eastern Sendaria, about 60 leagues southeast of Darim, up in the mountains. Garan was a stonecutter. Didn't I tell you that once before?" Garion nodded. "A long time ago," he said. "You said you liked him and you used to visit him once in a while. Was my mother a Sendar then?" "No," Wolf said. "Ildera was an Algar, actually, the second daughter of a clan chief. Your aunt and I introduced her to Garan when they were about the right age. The usual sort of thing happened and they got married. You were born a year or so afterward." "When was the fire?" Garion asked. "I'm getting to that," Wolf said. "One of the enemies of your family had been looking for your people for a long time." "How long?" "Hundreds of years, actually." "That means he was a sorcerer too, doesn't it?" Garion asked. "I mean, only sorcerers live that long, don't they?" "He has certain capabilities along those lines," Wolf admitted. "Sorcerer is a misleading term, though. It's not the sort of thing we actually call ourselves. Other people do, but we don't exactly think of it that way. It's a convenient term for people who don't really understand what it's all about. Anyway, your aunt and I happened to be away when this enemy finally tracked down Garan and Ildera. He came to their house very early one morning while they were sleeping, and he sealed up the doors and windows and he set it on fire." "I thought you said the house was made of stone." "It was," Wolf said. "But you can make stone burn if you really want to. The fire just has to be hotter, that's all. Garan and Ildera knew that there was no way they could get out of the burning house, but Garan managed to knock one of the stones out of the wall, and Ildera pushed you out through the hole. The one who'd set the fire was waiting for that. He picked you up and started out of the village. We could never really be sure exactly what he had in mind. Either he was going to kill you, or maybe he was going to keep you for some reason of his own. At any rate, that's when I got there. I put out the fire, but Garan and Ildera were already dead. Then I went after the one who'd stolen you. Did you kill him? Garion demanded fiercely. I try not to do that any more than I have to, Wolf said. It disrupts the natural course of events too much. I had some other ideas at the time, much more unpleasant than killing. His eyes were icy. As it turned out, though, I never got the chance. He threw you at me. You were only a baby, and I had to try to catch you. It gave him time to get away. I left you with Polgara, and then I went looking for your enemy. I haven't been able to find him yet, though. I'm glad you haven't, Garion said. Wolf looked a bit surprised at that. When I get older, I'm going to find him, Garion said. I think I ought to be the one who pays him back for what he did, don't you? Wolf looked at him gravely. It could be dangerous, he said. I don't care. What's his name? I think that maybe I'd better wait a while before I tell you that, Wolf said. I don't want you jumping into something before you're ready. But you will tell me. When the time comes. It's very important, Grandfather. Yes, Wolf said. I can see that. Do you promise? If you insist, and if I don't, I'm sure your aunt will. She feels the same way you do. Don't you? I'm much older, Wolf said. I see things a little differently. I'm not that old yet, Garion said. I won't be able to do the kind of things you do, so I'll just have to settle for killing him. He stood up and began to pace back and forth, a rage boiling in him. I don't suppose I'll be able to talk you out of this, Wolf said, but I really think you're going to feel differently about it after it's over. Not very likely, Garion said, still pacing. We'll see, Wolf said. Thank you for telling me, Grandfather. You'd have found out one way sooner or later, the old man said, and it's better that I tell you than for you to get a distorted account from someone else. You mean Aunt Paul? Polgara wouldn't deliberately lie to you, Wolf said, but she sees things in a much more personal way than I do. Sometimes that colors her perceptions. I try to take the long view of things. He laughed rather wryly. I suppose that's the only view I could take, under the circumstances. Garion looked at the old man, whose white hair and beard seemed somehow luminous in the morning sun. What's it like to live forever, Grandfather? He asked. I don't know, Wolf said. I haven't lived forever. You know what I mean. The quality of life isn't much different, Wolf said. We all live as long as we need to. It just happened that I had something to do that's taken a very long time. He stood up abruptly. This conversation's taken a gloomy turn, he said. This thing that we're doing is very important, isn't it, Grandfather? Garion asked. It's the most important thing in the world right now, Wolf said. I'm afraid I'm not going to be very much help, Garion said. Wolf looked at him gravely for a moment, and then put one arm about his shoulders. I think you may be surprised about that before it's all over, Garion, he said. And then they turned and looked out over the prow of the ship, at the snowy coast of Sherrick sliding by on their right, as the sailors rowed the ship south toward Kamar and whatever lay beyond. Here ends Book 1 of the Belgariad. And here does end Book 1 of the Belgariad. Gotta find some place to put this down. So, that's it for Book 1. We're all done. But if folks are liking this enough, I'll continue on and maybe start up Book 2. In either case, I'm going to end the recording of that session now. But hang on a sec. So I'm going to end the recording, but then we'll keep up with the same broadcast on Facebook. So don't go anywhere.